The other name of my talk is When Precision Medicine Goes Wrong. So TERI, or as one of my patients said, I made the best decision I could at the time. So TERI said I could talk on anything, and I was reflecting on the fact that next year will be 30 years since I started my cancer genetics clinic. And I thought, what do physicians actually reflect on? And they actually reflect on their failures. So I'm going to give you 4 stories where genetic testing failed, and sort of the lessons that maybe we've learned. So why this topic? And obviously there's been a heavy emphasis on precision medicine, and that was just a fabulous talk before mine, that positively impact patients and their health. And all of you who develop pipelines, analytic tools, software, you're trying to make these as error-free and as up-to-date as possible. But, how often do you get to hear about what happens to individual patients? So this talk is based on 4 real patients of mine over the course of 30 years. Initials, ages, lots of things have been changed to increase anonymity. So the first story, we're going to go way back to the beginning, which is I actually started my clinic the year that BRCA1 was cloned. And so we're going to talk about one of my first patients. So she was around 40. Had a family history of cancer. I'll just use JC as her initials. She had several children, very concerned because her sister, despite her maternal family history of medicine, her sister now had developed advanced breast cancer. And she was very worried about her risk and her children's risk. So it's important to remember, many of you, actually I realized when I put the slide together, were not alive. Being at the yoga class and being 25 years older than everyone else there, that when we first did genetic testing, it was too expensive to sequence. And so we could do single mutations, and then we used other methods. So she learned about me because we did one of the earliest population-based testing of the Ashkenazi BRCA1 variants. BRCA2 had not been discovered yet. And she and her relatives were negative for that. So her mom entered a research study, and we used a method called DGGE, denaturing gradient gel electrophoresis. And if anyone's got a thing of water or something, that would be great. Somehow I've got something in my throat. And this method was used because you couldn't sequence, and it actually is literally based on the fact that if you have a mutation and you have a gradient of a denaturant, those will form a bubble earlier than wild-type sequence. And you literally analyze people's DNA by seeing whether this line shifted. And that's how genetic testing was done. So her mother entered a study that did that for BRCA1, and it was negative. BRCA2 was discovered. Her mother was negative for the Ashkenazi, it's an Ashkenazi family. Her mother was negative, thank you so much, for that variant as well. Her mother then had BRCA2 testing by DGGE. That was negative. And so my patient was faced with this uncertainty. She continued to have careful breast cancer screening, had a few positive mammograms. This predates MRI, had needle biopsies to clarify it. And she comes back and says, genetics is not going to provide her an answer. I don't want to continue screening. She has a prophylactic mastectomy. And she actually had multiple postoperative complications. This was not simple, but survived all of that. So what happens next? In the 5 years after the surgery, full sequencing becomes available, and her mother and sister have tested. And in fact, I had to go back and look it up, a pathogenic nonsense variant in BRCA2 was identified in both of them. So she comes back to see me because now she's got to decide whether to have a prophylactic oophorectomy. And it's time for me to order the test that's going to tell us the answer. So in getting ready for the disclosure visit, I remember very hesitantly opening the envelope. We used to get these results by mail. It always did feel a bit like playing God. It still does when you click on the results, like finding out someone's result before they know it. Of course, now, because of the US laws, at least in the United States, patients actually and doctors see the results at the same time. So she did turn out to be negative for the BRCA2 nonsense variant in her family. And I was really disappointed and faced the disclosure with trepidation because I was focusing on she had all this surgery, had made a major decision that turned out really to be unnecessary. Her response was totally different. She was delighted with the news. It's what she was hoping, because she was focused on her kids, right? The fact that she was negative meant that her children, who by now were getting closer to adult years, didn't have to worry about the financial risk. So I had focused on her prior decision, the surgery. As a mother, she was really focusing on the future. And I still, we talked about her decision to have surgery, and I still remember very distinctly saying, I made the best decision I could make at the time with what I knew. And I think, it highlights an important lesson that we always are making medical decisions with incomplete information. The family, and I've kept in touch with them over the years, feels they really overcame their early history between genetic testing, prophylactic surgery. Her sister survived, had entered a breast cancer treatment trial, survived her treatment, had a prophylactic oophorectomy. The family's doing well. And they understood that our knowledge was new at the time, and they participated in really some of the earliest genetic testing studies for these genes. And certainly it's important for participants to understand that being an early participant includes, risks of incomplete information. And I know to many of you, DGGE may sound very primitive now. How could we even done that as a test? But, if you look into the future 5 years, mapping reads to one reference genome for exome testing may sound very primitive compared to hopefully doing perhaps de novo assembly of a genome for every patient. So I think one lesson of this talk is as technology improves, genetic test results will change. Okay, next patient. The quote is, "the worst news ever." So now we're in 2008. CW was a 28-year-old patient and a postdoctoral fellow, that turns out to be relevant, at Baylor. He had seen an ophthalmologist, had a retinal abnormality called a retinal hemangioma that would need laser treatment to preserve vision. But this can be a feature of an early sign of a cancer syndrome, von Hippel-Lindau cancer predisposition syndrome, that actually has a high risk of several different cancers, and these are all the different cancers you can get with VHL. And so we told him, well, this was a standard indication for genetic testing for this, the retinal lesion. He was obviously very worried about what this might mean. He was a healthy young adult. His health had otherwise been excellent. He actually mentioned to me at the visit that he was from China, and at that time, at least, he was very concerned about potential stigma of being diagnosed with a genetic condition. He was extremely anxious about having testing. He worried about even telling his wife. And he really doubted he would tell any family members back in China if he had turned out to be positive. So I'm sure you can guess where this is going. We sent the test to the most experienced lab in the country. VHL was the poster child of cancer genes, where we found mutations in almost every patient, and it came back positive. So, and at that time, it was a disease-associated mutation. That's the language that was used then. The report noted that this was a published promoter variant that had been shown to disrupt a transcription factor binding site important for VHL expression. I was so worried about the visit, I actually worked with a psychologist. It was very common in the 90s and 2000s to actually have psychologists as part of cancer genetics clinics. People were so worried about genetic testing. I had her attend the disclosure visit, and his response to the results were, "this is the worst news ever." We offered him support, helped him with regard to how he might let other family members know, and what was indicated for him. So if you have a VHL diagnosis, you have to have brain MRIs, spine MRIs, abdominal MRIs, you have to have lab tests. Again, this is not a minor intervention. They all came back negative, not that unusual for a young adult. And about a year later, he told me he was completing his postdoc, had a faculty position, was moving outside of Texas. I referred him to an experienced cancer genetics colleague in his new city. And he established care with her and had another set of negative surveillance scans, and then got lost to follow-up. So 6 years later, I looked it up, January 2017, I got an email from my colleague. She was seeing him back, and she hadn't seen him for about 5 years. She has a routine practice, Heidi will like this, she has a routine practice of looking up patients' genetic test results in ClinVar before seeing them back in clinic. Even though this was a pathogenic result, there had been no uncertainty. I will not mention the word VUS in this whole talk. I just want to make that clear. These are all positive results. This variant actually was now called benign and likely benign by many other labs. And in fact, one noted that it was in about 4.5% of the Chinese population. Interestingly, the original testing lab did not submit variants to ClinVar at that time. And I just looked it up in Nomad to make this talk, and I don't know if you can read it, but of South Asian 296,000 alleles, 1,500 people carried one, and there were actually 56 homozygotes. So this information alone is like enough to say this is a benign variant. So the original, actually, we contacted the original lab. They made me, as the ordering physician, even though I had no medical relationship with the patient anymore, request the updated report, and it came back as this patient carries a benign variant. So apparently, all those years before, he had a sporadic retinal hemangioma. It's still unclear whether he had more than one in his one eye, and he didn't have VHL. So my colleague emailed me after she met him to tell him the news, and she said, luckily, given his profession, he was pretty interested in the whole process, understood what happened, and was just happy to hear the news. So there are lots of ClinGen themes in this story. The importance of data from diverse populations for improving clinical genomics has been documented many times over. The importance of structured classification rules based on strength of evidence shouldn't be underestimated. If we took what we knew then and applied the 2015 rules and the ClinGen recommendations for functional data, it probably would have been a VUS and not pathogenic. Obviously, submission to ClinVar was critical here. It was very easy to tell right away, even though the lab itself didn't submit, that other labs all knew this variant was benign. And I've certainly adopted my colleagues' practice of looking up variants before I see patients back. Story 3 is actually published, so I'll go through it quickly. And it's entitled, You Said Her Sister Was Negative. So this is a story of more than one cancer predisposition syndrome that we published many years ago in the New England Journal. The proband, a young child, had been diagnosed with 2 different types of cancer by the age of 2. Her father had sort of a classic P10 or Caldin hamartoma syndrome. We tested her and was positive for what was called a pathogenic missense variant, actually much later shown to actually be a splicing variant. And her sister was tested because she needed screening and was negative. 6 months later, the family is on vacation between their child's cancer treatments. The healthy sister develops severe headaches, gets rushed to the emergency room in California, and the MRI reveals a large brain tumor. So the family is coming back home, they recontact our hospital, and the message I get is, you said her sister was negative, right? So it turns out in this case, and I'm sorry, it's probably not readable, the original proband actually carried a pathogenic variant in P10 and P53. We had only done one test at the time. And this healthy sister actually carried the TP53 variant. So Caldin came through on the father's side, and Li-Fraumeni syndrome came through on the mother's. It's a very tragic story. Both daughters died of malignancy very young. The child with both mutations, who's described in detail in the paper, developed 4 malignancies by the age of 4. Each parent was given a cancer predisposition diagnosis and had to have follow-up, for their diagnosis. And I really have great respect for these parents. They spent very long periods of time supporting their hospitalized children, often undergoing cancer treatment at the same time. And they would often discuss how unlucky they were, but they did not express frustration with the situation or the sequential nature of the diagnosis. And so this relates to the prior talk about doing limited testing versus larger testing. So you may think, okay, that's single genes, we don't do it that way anymore. So Baylor actually has put a lot of effort into looking at this question from an exome perspective, and Jennifer Posey published this article a couple of years ago that about 5% of diagnostic exomes have more than one diagnosis related to the clinical phenotype. We need to try to avoid being too narrow in selecting genetic test order, although what was not mentioned in the prior talk is insurance often will require that you order, I fight with that all the time, a limited test. And for those of you designing pipelines for genome scale analysis, it's really important to not just go, okay, we found the answer, but to look at all potential answers. Because we really have to look at all variants that might explain even part of the phenotype. So the last story, and I'll probably make up time in case people have questions for either of us and violate TERI's TERI talk rule, is the mutation wasn't actually there. And this, I think, is a real cautionary tale for the era we're entering. So AB was a 12-year-old girl who presented with multiple juvenile polyps. And that's a particular type of benign polyp. It's often genetic. And I ordered a standard polyposis panel. Although, in fact, what we went on to publish is that most children without a family history of juvenile polyps often have negative testing. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, we knew some were positive. This patient actually had a positive test result for a SMAD4 complex duplication. The lab cited a publication showing that the majority of these duplications in tumor suppressor genes disrupt function, and they called it pathogenic. SMAD4-associated juvenile polyposis has a very high lifetime risk of cancer. It has the highest of all the juvenile polyposis genes. Also, they're at risk for serious vascular anomalies. And so anyone who's positive for this gene not only has to have colonoscopy, and we're talking about colonoscopy for children here, but also has to have these vascular MRI studies and things like that. Her sister, who was otherwise healthy, also tested positive for the SMAD4 duplication, and both sisters were recommended to have the vascular workup and ongoing surveillance by colonoscopy. So you can already tell something must happen if I'm talking about it. So now in 2020, 2 amended test reports arrived. And this is a quote, I just took out the exons. Through additional analysis, the previously reported gross duplication of exons XX was determined to be present in the SMAD4 process. I think they mean processed pseudogene, not the SMAD4 gene. Is classified as a likely benign variant and is not routinely reported. So essentially, it was a negative test result. It was an abnormality in a duplication. So the sibling was now a young adult, and we reached out to her directly, as well as to the original patient's mother. In the interim, they had each had several colonoscopies. There was actually only one subsequent polyp picked up in the original patient, none in the sibling. And the family was relieved to hear the news. They were particularly relieved to hear it at that point, as the 2 girls were sort of entering young adult years, and so they wouldn't have to worry about it. So lessons from that case. Sorry, I picked this graphic, which I now I'm not sure is readable. So I think this is really a cautionary tale as we move towards telomere to telomere genome builds. I think the telomere to telomere work is incredibly exciting, but I think we're going to learn that a lot of rearrangements and things that have been previously reported may not actually be what we thought they were. Again, it may be a small number, but I think that this is going to happen. The difficulty of analyzing genes with complex patterns of pseudogenes really remains a diagnostic challenge. I think one that labs are well aware of, but continues to be a struggle. And there are many apparently genetic disorders, like why should a child have 6 or 7 juvenile polyps, where over half the children test negative, and where we really do need more research. Is this an epigenomic phenomenon? Is this a somatic mutation phenomenon? So if you want to summarize this talk, you could say this sounds like a disaster. Like, why are we even doing genetic testing? So I thought back on how commonly does this occur. So I could think about 7 such examples in my practice. I see anywhere from 150 to 200 patients. I saw more in the past, so maybe 6,000, which may be an overestimate. So you're talking maybe 1 in 100 patients might have had such a dramatic change in their test result. I'm sure this is an overestimate. My clinic's been involved in several studies that would be called cutting edge. Baylor was one of the first places to do clinical exomes, things like that, although I didn't really give an exome result. But these things happen. And most of the patients I described were tested using methods considered completely standard for the time. And these all went to different labs. In fact, I think Baylor may have only been involved in one of these cases at all. So this is not like one lab is the problem. So to just end, well, two thoughts to end. One is I sort of created this graphic. What are all the things that go into the evolving quality of genetic testing? So there's obviously technical improvements, from the really early days to Sanger, to exomes, to genomes, hopefully to somatic variation and epigenomes more prominently. We're constantly learning, right? We learned first about common or highly penetrant genes, then dozens of disease genes. Heidi talked about thousands. But we really know almost nothing now about gene-gene interactions or certainly gene-environment effects. Genome knowledge, obviously, in terms of what does the genome actually look like. When BRCA1 and 2 was tested, we didn't have a genome. When VHL was tested, we didn't have a genome. We just knew what that locus looked like. Then we had the early builds. Now we have T to T. There's work on pangenome references. And then obviously the population knowledge. I gave one example. For those of you, again, who are young, the early papers would literally say, I looked at this variant in 100 controls. The 100 controls might have no relationship to the population the patient was in. I didn't find it. I found it in my patient. Voila, it's a disease locus. There are lots and lots of papers written like that in the 90s. Then we got Exact and Nomad. We obviously need really responsible global representation. We have many countries that don't want to share their data in ways that we, people, quote unquote, want, and we have to figure out responsible ways to do that. And then particularly ClinGen really is in some ways this sort of gray box, which is the importance of data sharing across all of this, but also what often gets left out are sort of frameworks for how do we assess knowledge. Heidi mentioned yesterday that there's a new classification system, a committee I'm on as well, and we spent a lot of time thinking about better ways to assess the evidence. And all of these things taken together are really important when you're trying to design genetic tests. But my last slide is, of course, the human lessons, which is, patients and families expect us to provide them accurate diagnoses. And they need to be informed as results change over time. And we, in the United States, as you just heard a great example of our fragmented health system, we're not very good at doing that. I happen to be the same doctor. I literally now see the children of my prior patients, but that's extremely rare. And so we don't have great ways of following up. For those of you more on the computational side, part of the reason I gave the stories is to remember that the data in the pipelines represent real patients and families, and they're going to make important decisions. They're going to decide about surgery, they're going to decide about colonoscopy, about imaging based on the results. And so it's really important for you to do your best work when creating these tools and pipelines used for genetic testing to finally have the highest quality you can. And then I just want to acknowledge, and I tried to point out throughout, the generosity of spirit of the patients and families that I've had the honor to care for in almost 30 years of genetics practice. Thanks.
In gross violation of the rules, we have 1 or 2 minutes for questions.
Anyway.
Maybe Terry, would you like to ask the first question?
Oh, no, we have someone. Yes.
Go ahead.
This was really a great talk, also the previous one. I wondered about protective variants. You didn't talk so much about that. Of course, they are included in some of the more extensive sequencing efforts. But what are your views on how protective variants should be handled? They are harder to identify, but what's your views?
Oh, protective.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great story, and I think that, much of our research isn't designed to find them, and I think that is one of the advantages, perhaps, of polygenic risk scores, is that does allow us to look at both sides. Genetic testing is really identifying people we think have something and then look for it, but go ahead.
Yes, my question was, based on these experiences, have you changed how you counsel patients or how you train the next generation to assess this information, to say, hey, this is what we found now, we need to just, if it's something that's not widely reported, we will continue to check as things get updated.
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think, the interesting thing is early on, if patients had like unexpected negative results, families would say to me, well, should we send it to another lab or the other way? And I used to always totally poo-poo that. I decided to not give the two stories where that happened, where one lab didn't find it, the other did. I have the advantage now that we have a cancer prevention clinic that follows them long-term. And so we don't lose touch with them the same way I might have in the past. But I think I'm still an optimist, even despite this information. I still think we're trying to give them the best result we can at the time. But I'm certainly aware that, things can change.
Let's thank Sharon and Vernon for 2 great